Welcome back to another episode of Startup Health Now. I'm your host, Logan Plaster. Well, it has been a week. Our team is back from another packed trip to HLTH in Las Vegas, where we met up with nearly 50 members of the startup health community. Personally, I got to do about 40 in-person interviews in the Startup Health studio, and I am excited to share all of them with you in coming weeks on the podcast and on our YouTube channel. But today we're talking about storytelling and why every founder needs to embrace their role as chief communicator.
I think that if you are a founder or a CEO or a leader of the business, that is your job. You are the evangelist. You are the chief communicator. Like, who else is going to do that?
Our guest is none other than Chrissy Farr. Currently a managing director at Manat, Chrissy is best known for her many years as a health tech journalist for national outlets like Fast Company, NPR, and CNBC. She's also been an investor at Omer's Ventures, which gives her a rare perspective. She's been on the receiving end of pitches as a member of the media, and she's been on the inside, helping founders in her portfolio craft their story to resonate with that same media.
I think the best strategies for any startup are to be really bold in the way that you communicate, to be very honest, to be very direct, and, to say real things.
We'll get into all of that and take questions from the founders on the call. Questions like, how should your comms department use ChatGPT? How much time should a founder allocate to communications each week? How do you quantify the value of your comms efforts? Oh, and should you use TikTok? This episode, which was pulled from a recent Startup Health Masterclass, is packed with strategies you can use today. So get ready to take notes. Let's get into it. Give us a little bit of a sense of the kind of work you're doing at Manat now, what this job is.
As you all know, I started off in journalism. I was in that role for almost a decade. I worked across Fast Company. I was at Reuters for a little bit. I was at NPR. It was eventually CNBC. So I've done all different kinds of media, from television to print to radio, and I loved it. I had such a great time. And then decided to go into venture during the pandemic. Candidly, I was covering COVID, and this was when I was still at CNBC, and I just got so many death threats. It was just completely insane for about a year. And this was back in the time frame that people thought the media was evil and that COVID was a hoax perpetuated by some kind of shadowy figures. I have no idea, but there was a lot of crazy stuff happening at that time. So I was also pregnant while this was happening, and it just became a lot. And so I started to think, what else is out there, and just having existential thoughts about the future of media, which I'm happy to talk about with people over a few glasses of wine. But then I decided to go into venture, and the reason I did that was because I was just fascinated by the stories that I wasn't hearing being in media. Like, you hear one version of the story, which is usually the successful version of what companies want to portray. And you don't usually see kind of the insides of companies, the guts of companies, the way that they operate, the business models, the challenges. And so I wanted to see all that. And I also loved that aspect of venture. And I did that for about 4 years and had the opportunity to help start a company, invest in companies, and just really get into, the underbelly of companies and see why digital health is as hard as it is. And so, I think the chapter that I'm in now is one that combines kind of both of those. And I'm sorry for the long build up, but I think it kind of explains what I'm now doing at Manat. Which, it really is advisory work for companies. But the thing I tend to focus on more than anything else is I love helping companies raise money. And, everything from doing the deck work with them to helping them figure out kind of what's kind of normal in the market, because it's an absolutely crazy market right now. It just doesn't make any sense. And then helping them kind of reach the right investors. And that's the work that I tend to be doing most days. And I love it because it's narrative, it's storytelling, but it's also, it's capital. And it's capital is what we need for these companies to grow.
So when you moved into venture, you wanted to see the other side of the table. You wanted to pull back the curtain. What were some of the things that may have surprised you once you finally sort of saw how all of the inner workings and how it really kind of worked out?
Okay, so I'll tell you a story. there was this amazing analyst where I worked. He was just one of these people that like, I'm not one of these people and I wish I was, but they could pull up Excel and just within seconds, like have built an amazingly complex model, like one of those people. And so she came over to my house one afternoon and we were looking at a data room for a company. And it was a behavioral health company. I'm not going to name names. Um, but it was doing a combination of therapy and prescribing. And I just had this moment that like I will never forget when we started to analyze the business and I realized how awful the therapy part of it was from a business model perspective, not from an impact or like patient, outcomes or any of those good things, but purely for the sake, like just the financials. And then you look at the prescribing and it was like the way that the company was really making money and the margins were all down to the prescribing. And so suddenly it became clear to me why cerebral had happened and like all these things that I was covering when I was back in journalism. I was like, why is this pill mill thing exploding? And then suddenly in that moment I was like, this is why. And just having like throughout the course of my time in venture, just so many of those realizations where you can see how incentives get messed up. And you can see how healthcare and the way that it works today can kind of, pressure companies into doing things for the sake of growth that may not be the right thing for the patient or for the provider or for any of the other like really important stakeholders that, businesses should be incentivized to care about. And that's kind of what brought me to, again, what I'm doing today, which is just like, this stuff is hard and we all need help. And I'm a big fan of speaking truth about all of it because it is lonely to have to hear about nonstop hype because you wonder why you're the only one that's struggling. But we're all struggling with the same thing. So let's just be open about it.
Yeah. So you were telling those stories and then you sort of pulled back the curtain and you saw some of the inner workings. Now you're doing second opinion media. How is your knowledge of being an investor and advisor now shaping how you tell stories differently today, if at all?
Yeah. Well, second opinion, I started writing it a couple months into my venture job. And it was really, for me, it was just an outlet. I just wanted to continue writing. I wanted to continue to tell stories and, I love it. It's so much fun. And so I started just writing and I didn't have an editor. I didn't have anyone kind of, I wasn't in a newsroom, so I could do whatever I wanted. And that was the first time I'd really had the opportunity to do that in my career. And I got to see that people actually were reading. And, over the course of a couple of years, grew the thing from 0 to about 20,000 subscribers. And that was amazing. And it just kind of, made me realize that there was an audience for all the like grokky, insidery analysis that I wanted to do about the industry. And none of it is news. It's really just like hot takes on things. We did a great kind of guest column today on just why it's so hard in women's health and what are all the real obstacles that companies are facing. And that's the kind of piece that I like to publish on Second Opinion and the kind of piece that everyone who reads it seems to gravitate to. So it's been great seeing that there's an audience for it, and I continue to publish every week.
Love it. Let's get tactical about founder communications. You're writing a book about executive storytelling in business. We've got all of these founders on the call who really need to be thinking about this on a day-to-day, a week-to-week basis. I want to talk about how honest is too honest, because you wrote on X, and I quote, "It's amazing to me how often the right answer is just to be open and honest, and how rarely companies take this approach." I want to talk about that because as an early stage startup, you have to cast a vision. You have to tell your story. Things have to be grand in some way. So how do you balance that? How do you suggest to the folks that you work with balancing that with this straightforward, plain language sort of honesty?
Yeah. So I think the job of being in communications is a very, very hard job. And people who are good at it are very special. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say on this topic, but I think the best strategies for any startup are to be really bold in the way that you communicate, to be very honest, to be very direct, and to say real things. But these are also, in the minds of many founders, higher risk strategies, because if you're bold and you say that tell the truth, then there's all kinds of things that all kinds of potential consequences that one could imagine. Maybe a customer gets upset about something. Maybe, you get criticized by somebody important. I think in reality, like, I think we build all of this up in our heads a lot more than is true. There isn't really an invisible committee of people waiting around, sitting around, trying to point to something that you've said and get really upset about it. I just don't think this really exists. And so, we should just be a little bit more bold than we are being. It's like, if you want to criticize a payer for something that they're doing, or, maybe you want to criticize something structural about the way that health plans are set up, you should just do that, because I've met a gazillion people who work at health plans and they would all agree with you. In fact, they would respect you for saying it out loud. Say the quiet part out loud. If we all did that, I think we would, find that it's just much easier to raise awareness and to get attention for what we're doing. Instead, it's just like, I feel like I see these company websites all day long where I'm like, I don't know what you do. Like, I literally it would take me like 20 minutes to figure it out. I have to like call a bunch of people to try to understand it. And I think we just all believe that we have to do it that way because it's the way that most people do it. But you don't have to. You can throw the rule book out the window.
What I hear you saying is that being plain spoken and clear and honest does not come at the expense of being bold. You can still be really putting out a bold vision for your company.
You can do them both at the same time. You can say, we're a company that does this for this using this kind of technology. And we come up against this sort of company and we want to beat this sort of company. And you can be an app and you can be a website. You don't need to be a platform. Like, you can talk to people instead of engaging people. You can use things versus leverage things. Like, you can just talk to people like we're all people, like, it doesn't have to be this like weird B2B marketing language that is like another language to me. It's like, I don't even understand it most of the time. And I've worked in this industry for almost, 15 years.
As you research your book, does a story stand out as a founder or a company that's done this particularly well that we can learn from?
Yeah. I mean, right now I'm like just professionally crushing on this company, Bobby. And I don't know if any of you have had kids, but if you've ever come across this infant formula called Bobby, the marketing around this company, it's amazing. I mean, the about video on the website made me cry. It was so emotional. If you have a few minutes, just, pop over to Bobby. It's like literally just BOBBIE and just look at some of the marketing materials. They've got a billboard up in Times Square right now that I think some people find controversial, but is just a giant image of a woman feeding her child. And it's just incredible. And I mean, they did a press release that I was looking at a few months ago where she acquired her business, and the main photo they used is the two women CEOs hugging. Like, when do you see that? So I just think that's a great example of someone who came along and said, I'm just going to do this differently. If there is a rule book, I'm not following it. And I think it's been really effective. I've read that they are one of the only breakout formula companies in this country since really the 1970s.
Interesting. You've got founders who are sort of naturals at this. Maybe they even come from a comms background or a marketing background. And then you got folks that maybe come from a research or science background and find it much, much more challenging. And yet they're still early enough stage that there's no one on the team that is specializing in communication. So I'm wondering what you think is wise in terms of time allocation for a founder to be thinking about weekly communications, getting better at storytelling. Let's say it hasn't really been on their radar before, but they're listening to you and they're thinking, okay, this needs to be part of my weekly regimen.
I think that it is your job. I think that if you are a founder or a CEO or a leader of the business, that is your job. You are the evangelist. You are the chief communicator. Like, who else is going to do that? Hiring somebody else or outsourcing it to somebody else and saying, "Hey, Chrissy, go talk about my company." I would say, I don't know why am I being hired to talk about your company? I don't know anything about your company. I didn't start your company. I don't wake up every morning thinking about your company. Like, you're the best person to be doing that. And I totally understand the feedback that you've got a million other things to be doing with your day. It's really, you've got valuable things to do. You got to recruit, you got to operate, you got to manage all your investors and your board. And it's tough stuff. But at the same time, you will not be as effective outsourcing the way that you talk about your company. You will not be effective at outsourcing the public face of your company. It's truly something that you need to own first. And then I think over time, as the company gets bigger, like bring on a whole internal team, because there are a lot of aspects to the job that you can't be doing single-handedly. But the first person who should get really good at telling the story is you.
Yeah. Tactically speaking, does that mean blog posts, scripts for your deck, working with a ghostwriter, LinkedIn posts, X posts? Where do you suggest that a very busy founder kind of focus their storytelling time each week?
Just stay in your zone of genius. Like, if you are someone who I said to you, go write a column, and you said that gives me hives, I would, I'm literally crying thinking about that. Don't do it. Don't hire a ghostwriter. Just don't do it at all. Like, you don't enjoy it, don't do it. So figure out what you would enjoy. Like, maybe it's that could go talk to a group of people at a conference, or you could do a lot of social media. Maybe you're like really comfortable with Twitter, where you only have to write like 100 characters or something. Like, pick something that you can do and just go excel in that area. And I think over time, like, practice makes everything a little bit easier. But there are things that, I sort of pride myself on being open and being publicly facing. And there are things that I still won't do. Like, I can't even imagine getting on TikTok. There is no way I'm going to do that. But I have found things that I love. Like, I love to write, and I feel very natural and comfortable doing it. And I feel comfortable with, audio. I don't feel that comfortable in video. So I just do the things that, like, I feel good about, and I don't try to do everything. And I think you can operate in the same way.
Yeah. Some founders are thinking of generative AI as maybe a cheat code for some of their communications. I know you have I know you have strong feelings about that. So how do you see sort of best case, worst case in terms of using AI to speed you up as a founder doing your comms?
I would not use AI for this purpose. I think it can be helpful for, maybe you interviewed somebody, or you want to aggregate some research, or, put together a summary. But the writing is thinking. Like, if you want to sit down and really write something out, and even if you never even present it anywhere, but you just want to use that as a way to kind of think about a problem and figure out, what do you actually think about it? Like, what would you say when asked? The process of just writing it down will help you think. I promise you. It's like this very amazing human thing. So, I don't think AI is going to do it. There's no way to get AI to do that for you. And to be honest with you, like, I still get a bunch of submissions for columns for my Second Opinion newsletter, and what the AI ones, I can just tell it's really obvious. And I get a lot of them. There's all kinds of like words that AI likes to use that humans don't really use. And so they're tells. So I would say, like, just use it for, like, helping you with research. And I used it a little bit for my book when I was writing my book, but I didn't let AI, write a single word of the actual book. It was more just kind of like aggregating. And I think that's the better use of it.
Yeah, I love that you said writing is thinking, because not only will it not give you the final product that you really want, it will rob you of the critical time that you could have been processing the information.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I loved journalism so much, is it for all the writing every single day. It just, like, it really forced me to get into what I really think. And that's, people talk about thought leadership all the time. And my friend Jackie Miller, who's a great communications leader, always says, like, to do thought leadership, you have to have actual thoughts, which sounds simplistic, but it's so true. Like, most of us don't have time to think. We don't make time in our day to go for a walk and just think, or do a writing project and think. Like,
Yeah.
that's so important for the job that you're in. And if you want to be doing things that are externally facing, you have to have actual thoughts and opinions. Otherwise, it's just going to end up sounding super generic, which is, I think, what most companies
Yeah.
have, deferred to, because it's just the lack of time and attention.
That's a hot take for today. You have to have actual thoughts to be a thought leader. I love it. We're going to take a few minutes and take some questions from the chat. And let's start with Catherine from ReadySpec. Catherine, you can come off of mute and give us 30 seconds on what you are building and give us your question.
Sure, thank you. So I'm Catherine Bornbaum. I'm the Chief Business Officer of ReadySpec, and we are working to transform the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease using non-invasive retinal imaging mixed with AI. I love your second opinion column. Thank you for all of the work there. One of the things you do really well with it is sort of aggregate where you see trends, be it in women's health or digital health. I would love to hear your thoughts, a further aggregation for the group, if you will, on where you see the future of health tech investment. I think you had some really interesting insights in the one from today about, investors are looking for TAM. They haven't gotten their money back from LPs. What does the future look like from your perspective? Sort of former VC now with a little bit of space from that. I would love to hear it.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think if you're an AI business, like, you'll probably do okay. Anything else like tech-enabled services, diagnostics, anything, really that, most other areas except AI, I think it's going to be a little bit of a struggle bus for the next few years. And the reason I say that is because, like, even the other areas that are really tough, like fintech, they've had Stripes and they've had Plaids and they've had enough of these like $10 billion plus outcomes that have, provided liquidity back into the sector, that have allowed VCs to raise follow-on funds. And we just haven't had that in health tech yet. Like, I think, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure I am, but I think our biggest success story right now is Doximity, and they're valued at about 8 billion last I checked. So we haven't even really had a single one that's like truly broken out. So that's a problem. And I'm not going to pretend it's not. I think it's going to get more and more challenging as companies go from raising kind of seed and A all the way kind of through to growth rounds, which have become really, really tricky. That said, I remain quite optimistic because as I've kind of canvassed, some of the VCs that I know and spoken to them, like, there are a lot of great companies that are further along that are not yet public, and they do have a lot of revenue. And I think if these companies can figure out the right timing and the right story, once they hit, become public companies and hit the market, like, I think that changes things. It proves that there are successes in digital health. It's just a really bad time right now. It's a tough time because everybody raised a lot during, the 2021 period. Everybody's now running out of that money and has to raise again. It's a tough moment. Like, the IPO window is really not open right now. So if you can kind of, somehow manage to get through the next couple of years, and a lot of companies are doing that by cutting burn and staying lean as possible, then I think there is a light at the end of the tunnel. But I think it's just going to be a gritty, hard period for the next, number of months. And I'm just hopeful that the Omadas of the world and some of the rest of them that supposedly have filed to go public will do right by us as an ecosystem.
Thank you.
Appreciate the question, Catherine. Cool. Let's move on to Mark Rothman from Lizzie Care. Mark, you can go ahead and explain what you do briefly and ask your question.
Hey guys, Mark Rothman, if you can hear me.
Yep.
Earbuds in. CEO of Lizzie Care, co-founder, tech-enabled services for dementia care at home. My question wasn't really about the difference, but I appreciate that everyone chiming in. It's really about time management. I feel like I get pulled into marketing all day long, and then I am the communicator in chief. Besides that, but just sort of thinking a little bit about your comments about not hiring folks to do all your communications, but to some degree, that marketing piece, some of it has to be industry acceptable. I don't want to say boilerplate, but there is a minimum standard where communications give so much more freedom. How do you think a little bit about time allocation for things like marketing versus comms to the board, to investors, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think of marketing and communications as being different things. And I think a lot of companies make the mistake of having their comms teams to report to marketing and then marketing reports into the C-suite. Comms should not report to marketing. Marketing is really concerned with, making sure that there is enough demand out there in the market for the product and, really converting kind of eyeballs and growth and things like that. Communication should be concerned about reputation writ large and brand writ large, and it should be able to report into the CEO and then float across every department. Like communication should also be sitting within legal, sitting within human resources and recruiting, should be basically like cross-functional, and able to really help the company achieve goals across every different area and not just marketing. Like it is not purely a marketing function. And I think when you put comms underneath marketing, it just gets concerned with the wrong things, which is a lot of these fake metrics like website traffic, which may be completely irrelevant and not meaningful. But you force comms into a sales and marketing vernacular and into basically just having some kind of set of metrics that they can report each quarter that then flows up to the CEO, who can then say, oh, we've done a great job. We've got more hits to our website. But what do those hits to the website mean? Meanwhile, the things that may actually be very valuable for a communications team and a CEO to be doing in the long term, which relate much more to the brand, could take a lot more time. Like it's not, if you started, say, a whole newsletter or something like that, which I've helped a few companies strategize on. One of the companies I work with just landed Sanjay Gupta for an interview for their new newsletter. Something like that, we could never have envisioned going into it that would happen. But it's just because they just spent the time on it and they didn't force it into a set of neat metrics that can be put on a presentation and presented to the CEO every quarter. It was just something that they decided to do because it aligned so much with their brand. And I think that's kind of, I know this is a little bit complicated and maybe not the answer that you were looking for, but I think sometimes it's just having faith in the process and allowing the people around you who know what they're doing to just like spend a few quarters working on something for the sake of the brand that will have that really long-term payoff that I think paid marketing isn't going to deliver and increasingly will not be delivering in the near future because it's just becoming more and more expensive and the ROI is just less tangible than it used to be. So I see a lot more companies now just really converting over to brand marketing much more, companies like Airbnb, Bobby, and many others, and just seeing so much more success out of that. But to do brand marketing well, you also have to be spicy and you have to be bold and you have to be creative. And like, it's a totally different skill set, but I think it's way more fun.
That's great. That's great. I really like that idea of comms being independent and being cross-functional across the business. Let's go to Alexandra from Care Team. I think you had a couple questions in the chat, so if you could just focus on one of them at the moment.
Sounds great. And nice to see you again, Chrissy. I appreciate all your writing. I'm a physician and I run Care Team. We're a new type of integrated care solution, very much in spirit of what Bentley shared the article about point solution fatigue. And one of the things we're finding is that a lot of the investors are asking for these bold and innovative ideas, and they're very much framed in the older model of hospital delivered care or how things are done today. And so where are the investors who are really bold and innovative and wanting to back founders who are changing the status quo for the next wave of how healthcare will be delivered?
Yeah, it's hard to find because a lot of investors have LPs that are the systems and the payers, and there is something very appealing about building things for them that just makes their processes a little bit more kind of efficient. But it's not really changing healthcare. I think if you want to do that, you have to be an even better storyteller than everyone else. because you're asking people to believe in a future that is hard to envision. I mean, I had this great quote that I put in my book from somebody at Founders Fund, who said, they do a lot of this kind of deep tech, big vision type of investing. And they said, something like Facebook, you don't need to be a great storyteller, because if you're trying to pitch Facebook, you just say, download it. Download it, try it, let me know what you think. And that's how Facebook went viral. Like Mark Zuckerberg could get away with not being a great storyteller for years. But if you are, building the next self-driving car or building the next great invention for healthcare that may not even, maybe the science has to check out. Maybe you're doing something that's going to require regulators to approve it, and it could take a decade or longer. Or maybe it's something where the system isn't even set up to support it. There's no reimbursement that even exists today. Then you have to be able to sell a vision and get people really excited by this future that you are building and making possible, and you have to bring them along with you. And I think that's very difficult, but there are people that have done this very effectively, and there are funds that invest in areas like deep tech, or that invest in what I would call the shadow healthcare system, which is a lot of the great consumer health companies that don't integrate at all with payers, that are purely cash pay. So they do exist. They're just harder to find. And it's, you're looking at sort of what the 1% versus the 99%.
Chrissy, in your research for your book, do you have any examples of great storytellers that were telling a bold, maybe even spicy, as you say, vision for a company that on its face might have been a bit boring? Maybe it's a platform, it's patient engagement, it's one of these, it's data. It's something that on its face seemed difficult to turn into a story, but they did so successfully. I'm wondering if you have any examples of that.
Yeah. So I think Athena Health and you guys are going to maybe groan if you've been in the industry a long time, because they've been around since, I think, the 90s. They've been around a long time. But I was talking to John Halleck, who was the first head of communications there. I think he joined when he was in his early 20s, very fresh. And he eventually went on to run communications at Quantum and Livongo and a number of others. So he's great. And he said that they were trying to make Athena cool for a long time, which is hard to do because it's like enterprise software. It was basically a cloud-based EMR. How do you make that cool? So they had this idea that because they were running and processing claims, as all EMRs were, that they knew which payers were the slowest and which payers were the quickest in paying back provider offices after they filed claims. And they took this data and aggregated it, the fastest to the slowest payers, and then sent it to the New York Times. And the New York Times published it and named all of these plans as being fast versus slow. And of course, the ones who were fast look good and the ones who were slow look bad. And so it's super risky, right? Because you just made a bunch of enemies. But they also were on the front page of the New York Times' health section, and it put them on the map. And it's not something I would expect many companies to do today, or I've seen many companies do today, but I think it's quite a stroke of genius. And I included that story in the book because, I love stuff like that. Yes, you can see that there are clear risks and there are consequences to doing something like that. But I think there are risks and consequences, negative consequences to being boring. Yeah. I think a lot of companies fail because they're boring. And because they're boring, they can't hire the best people. They can't raise money. And maybe the company is so great because it's got such an amazing operational model that it doesn't matter. But most of the time it does. So always be doing that analysis in your mind of there are going to be risks to being bold, but there are also risks to being boring.
I love it. I love that. Let's go to Chuck's question. Chuck from NeuroEM, if you can come off of mute.
Hello. Cut me off
Hi.
for a second. Hello, Chrissy. I'm Chuck Giorgio. I'm the CEO of NeuroEM. And, most drugs, the best they can do for Alzheimer's is slow the decline. And they have horrible side effects like brain hemorrhage and death. But we have a device that actually stops and reverses the effects of Alzheimer's. 15 years worth of research, 9 patents, and we're taking it to market. And the question I had for you, I did not come out of the health tech space. I came out of the AI space. And regulators I can usually manage, fintech and operational technology. But the regulators in the healthcare space are kind of mean and very not necessarily appreciative of the effort that it takes to be out there. So how do you balance? Look, the FDA filed the company because some consumer posted in one of their boards using a device for a purpose not intended for, and they tagged the company. The company's like, it's a board, a consumer, it doesn't matter. So how do you balance the bold and spicy with regulators? I got to be careful. I say something, and the next thing you know, and I have a fashion problem. I don't look good in orange and white stripes. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit above my pay grade because I'm not a legal expert. But what I would say is try to find innovative lawyers, like find people that, and to plug Manette, like I work with a lot of these people where instead of just saying no to everything, like what can you say yes to within the confines of this kind of risk analysis that we were talking about? You obviously do not want to have the FDA come after you. I've seen that movie before, and it doesn't usually end well. So you certainly want to have good counsel around you, but then say, what can I do? Like, I don't want you to just tell me what I can't do. I want you to tell me what I can do. And work within those confines and that box, even if it's a smaller one. And then again, from the book, I mean, this company I mentioned, Bobby, the infant formula one, when I first met them, they had a great story about how they were going to just fundamentally like upend formula and change everything. And they had this whole idea of like using really natural ingredients and things like that. And then they went super quiet, actually, because the FDA came after them and said, you described yourself as an infant formula company and you're not an infant, you didn't get cleared yet to be an infant formula. And so, at that point, they probably could have died. But instead, they just got better counsel. They started to work very closely with FDA. And they published, to everyone, to the world, like all the steps that they had taken to make sure that their formula was safe and that they were working closely with regulators and everything that they had done to fix the problem. And whenever asked about it, just kind of clearly said, this is what we've done. These are the steps we've taken. And I think I went from thinking this company's dead, like no mother is going to buy infant formula from a company that has gotten, in trouble with FDA, to thinking, wow, they actually might get through this. And now nobody even talks about it anymore, or even remembers it, because they were so successful. And I think a lot of that comes down to just the transparency piece that we've also talked about. Make calculated risks, and then just know that the answer is usually to tell the truth.
Well, thank you.
Very nice. Good question. And I love that idea of finding an innovative legal team that tells you what you can do, not just what you can't do. We have time for a few more questions, but we're going to try to keep them relatively quick. Neil from InRange, you can come off mute.
Sure. Hi, I'm Neil Israel, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of InRange Animation. We help companies tell their story through animated videos, and actually, so we work closely with the CEO, so we are telling their story. But I just wanted to know from your perspective, is there a story that you can think of where it was a failure and what you learned from it?
A failure for me, or for one of the
like a communications failure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there have been a lot of communications failures. I think in most cases where I can think of examples, it's because the founder just kind of sidestepped, like, I can think of one example, and I'm not going to name names in this case because it's not something the founder chose to acknowledge publicly, but it was a founder that had a prior company that went bankrupt and then went on to raise a bunch of VC money. And a lot of people came out and said, why didn't you acknowledge the bankruptcy? You basically just changed the story from talking about your prior company as if it was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and then you moved on to this next company and you didn't ever really come out and say that the prior one had failed. And I think that is a constant like source of failure that I see, that people think that the only story they can tell publicly is a positive one. But I think if you start engaging with anyone externally, including the press, and you want to tell all these positive stories and talk about your milestones, then realize that you are signing up for also telling some of the negative stories too. You can't just tell this one-sided version to the market. You have to be able to articulate what went wrong. You have to be able to articulate downside risk. Like, otherwise you just sort of come across as a little bit two-faced, and nobody likes people like that. Like, we've probably all had friends that we meet up with them and they're like, everything's great all the time. And it's like, you don't want to hang out with people like that, right? Like, you want to hang out with people that will tell you the truth about what's really going on with them through the good times and the bad. And I think we have that same expectation of each other in more public settings. And so that's my warning to people, that it is, you know, if you are someone that couldn't tell the truth, and that's fine. Like, if you're someone who doesn't want to be public about when things don't go well, then don't be public about things when things are going right, because that is the expectation.
That's a great answer. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question, Neil. I mean, I've seen just recently on LinkedIn a few cases where folks have been more vulnerable about businesses failing, and the outpouring of love that you see. People want to hear that real story.
Yeah, Naomi Allen, Brightline. Check out that blog post that she did when they changed direction. I think that was a great example. You can go on her LinkedIn. She had hundreds of comments, hundreds of likes, people saying, thank you, thank you for telling the truth and not just quietly doing this. It's just better to get ahead of it, right? Like, it's going to come out. Yeah. You should just be honest about it. And most of us, we're all nuanced people. We're all capable of recognizing that things can change. Things can be tougher than we anticipated. It's okay. It's okay to change direction. Yeah. I think we forget that sometimes.
Yeah. Let's jump over to Bentley Adams from Way. Bentley, you can come off mute.
Cool. Hey, Chrissy, how are you? Good to see you. It's been a long time. I think the last time I saw you was like 6 or 7 years ago down in La Jolla at some genomics event. So, in another life, right, for both of us. But yeah, Way is an intuitive eating app. It helps people learn how to listen to their body and align their way of living and eating to their values. So it's kind of the opposite of a restrictive diet, but it also has the added benefit of helping people with emotional intelligence, physical intelligence, emotional regulation, and thus reducing perceived stress. So we found this B2B component to the business, but that's the source of the question. Is you wrote this article over the summer called basically around point solution fatigue. And so I was curious, now that you've had a few months to see the response from the article and just kind of learn more about it. Obviously, you did your normal due diligence up front on a great article, but what do you believe, given kind of this point solutions fatigue, is the best strategy to get into the B2B employee wellness, employer-employee wellness space? Because just kind of some context, you have these marketplace aggregators like, WellHub, GymPass, pivoted into that, Husk, Vitality, and they seem to like solve that point solution fatigue problem by aggregating. But a company like ours, like distributing through these marketplaces, is really at the whim of the employer marketplace relationship, and also adding this barrier of not owning the member engagement. So I'm curious what you see as the best strategy from like a true sales growth perspective, or what companies that you're seeing are actually having success to profitability, if you will, but also at the same time while being aware of investor perception, and they might not want to have some barrier to the revenue path, so, and the distribution path. So just curious what your thoughts or any feedback or the article.
I think we probably would have to do a strategy session on it, because it just is very dependent on a lot of different factors. I think the point solution thing is real. And I go to a lot of employer forums, and I spend time with heads of HR and benefits, and they all say the same thing. There are just too many vendors, and a lot of them are doing overlapping things. Plus, everybody is concerned with just rising costs, and it's a different market than it was a few years ago, and it's a saturated one. There's also a very real move away from just like PMPM models to kind of outcomes based, which can be hard depending on where your company sits and what you do. And then there's also challenges around, things like activation of members. You get these really interesting, hard, thorny problems where, you look at something like a type 2 diabetes, a lot of people have it. I mean, it's a huge TAM, but historically, we've seen very low rates of activation. So members just don't use it. Meanwhile, we have kind of areas that are more niche areas like oncology and GI, where you see very high rates of activation. I would also put women's health, pregnancy, infertility, some of these areas in that same bucket. So it just really depends where you sit. Like, is there a member base that would be very naturally engaged by the thing that you're offering? Do you have like clear evidence that it does something that an employer or a health plan cares about? Even then, it's still hard. So, maybe there's a different solution. I think it was interesting to see what Brightline ended up doing, where they said this whole national footprint thing doesn't really make sense. We're just going to like focus on a few geographies where we see a lot of patients potentially needing to use us. And then we're going to open up a physical clinic. Great marketing, right? Because think about how many people will walk by that clinic every single day, and we'll get tight relationships with those health plans on the ground and just focus on a few geos. And so I've seen that strategy kind of work well also. So it just really depends on, your specific type of business. But I would say no real change on the point solution thesis. It is still, I haven't heard anything different since I wrote that piece.
Okay. No, thank you so much. I mean, there are probably 10 other questions I want to ask you about that, but I'll leave it right there where it is.
Very nice.
But,
Thanks for the question, Bentley. We'll squeeze in a quick question from Travis from Symbiocell Tech.
Thanks. We're a cellular biologic, our space, but you've answered pretty much my question through a lot of this, which has been really good. But I think I've gained a lot from hearing about your experience on ineffective ways of storytelling. And I heard boring, sidestepping. And so can you think of some other examples? Because this is really helpful for us as we try to quantify and measure our efforts to the storytelling in a cadence of marketing, but, to measure the effectiveness of what we're doing. So maybe you could speak to a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think my best advice is to just allocate some resources to this without forcing it into something quantifiable. I think we've become very obsessed with data, especially data that shows progress, and it makes sense for a lot of different functions. But sometimes you just have to do it because you believe in it, because you see that there is going to be potential value there, and just let life happen. And it's really hard because we're so used to this way of doing work. But imagine you put out a great blog post that was a lot of hours and effort and time and thought, and like you could try to quantify it by saying how many people read this, like how many shares did I get? And maybe that would be a good metric. But an even better metric would be somebody comes up to you at a conference in a month from now and says, Travis, that piece was so good. And because of that, like I would love to walk you into a meeting with, my head of XYZ. And I see this all the time when companies just try and they start and they don't force it into the same kind of ways of measurement and KPIs that they would with other initiatives, because there's something a little bit more intangible about it. But I think when you start investing, you will see the results and the payoff very, very fast, especially if it's something that you do in a way that feels authentic to you and that you genuinely enjoy, so it's not a chore.
Appreciate the question, Travis. Chrissy, I want to give you the final word here. Having heard from 10 or so founders, any themes that you're connecting, and sort of final thoughts, words of wisdom for the folks that you've talked to today.
I think just find your tribe, find community, find people that will mentor you, because this business is really tough. And when you find them, keep them close.
Any tips on how to grow as a communicator? Books, courses, let's say someone really cares about it but feels like they've got a long way to go.
Well, I just filed the last draft of my book that I still
Step one, read your book.
Step
one. Be up.
If anybody has any good book titles, I need a book title for a book about business storytelling. So please send them to me. And by the way, ChatGPT did not help.
Okay.
So yes, I would say, there are books out there on the topic. Mine is coming out hopefully next year. But definitely just have fun with it. Just try and do it. Like I said, do the thing that you would find most enjoyable anyway, so it doesn't feel like work. And that's probably the right thing.
Yeah. I think you have got a lot of people thinking about how to be bolder and maybe even a little riskier about their storytelling. Because if you're going to be out there and taking the risk anyway of having a startup and being boring, you could fail anyway. So you might as well tell a great story and get out into the market.
100%.
Well, we appreciate your time, and we learned a lot from you, so appreciate it.
Cool to meet you guys. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. And thanks so much for having me, Logan. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Startup Health Now. We'll be back again with another episode next week.